Hi, and welcome to my channel. My gel printing process is to pull multiple prints from one roll-up of paint. Some of those I use directly for collage. Other prints I'll add more layers to. So the property of pigments are really important to getting the results I want. I need to know how a new layer will change the print. That is what this video is all about, with a little bit of theory and a lot of practical information. There are some useful exercises for you to try for yourself, so let's get started. First of all, let's take a look at that little bit of theory, the properties of color. Now, a lot of people already have one of these, a color wheel. This is the one that I like, and I'll leave the name of it down below in the description. But it's a very useful color wheel. It's got lots of extra added information on it other than just the basic colors. So let's take a look at the properties of color. The first one is hue. Hue simply means where on the color wheel the color sits. So, for example, yellow, or blue-green, or red-violet. The second property of color is intensity, which is also often referred to as chroma or saturation. Intense colors lie on the outer edge of the rim, whereas more neutral colors lie inside the rim. This wheel shows us that. So for example, if we start with a red-orange and we add a blue to it, you can see that the color is not only darker but duller as well. And the last property of color that we're going to talk about is value. And that is, to a degree, inherent in the color itself. So, for example, the yellows are the lightest of values of the colors, and the purples and the blues tend to be the darkest of the colors. The color wheel demonstrates color theory. You take two primary colors like red and yellow, and you mix them to get the secondary colors, like orange. Take a primary and a secondary, and you can mix that to get a tertiary color. But reality is a little bit different. In reality, we have pigments rather than the colors on the color wheel. So let's talk about the properties of the pigment in your paint. We again have hue, intensity, and value. Straight out of the tube, those paints will have those three things. An invaluable exercise to actually learn more about your pigments is to create your own color wheel. Take what you would think of as your primary yellow, primary red, and primary blue, and space those equidistant on a wheel. And then take your other tubes and paint them where you think that they're located between and around those. And again, the brightest colors would go on the outside edge of your new color wheel, and the more muted colors would go on the inside of it, until you get down to something that's very muted and very dark in the center. This is a great exercise to do. I labeled each of my paints so I'd remember what I used, and I gotta tell you, this took me about 3 tries. This is not the first one that I did. This is actually the third one that I did, and I finally kind of got the spacing to where I thought I got it right. Now, another property of your pigment, which is really important, particularly in gel printing, is transparency or opacity. And this is a very useful exercise to determine how transparent or opaque your paints are. I just painted a dark stripe. I think I used burnt umber or such. You could use black if you have it. Down the paper. And then I took each of the pigments that I had. They're all on this original wheel. And I painted them over top. And you can easily see which ones cover the dark stripe and which ones just vanish over the dark stripe. So this is an example of a very transparent color. I believe that's red iron oxide. And this is an example of a very opaque color. This is cadmium red. This is cadmium yellow, another really opaque one. And this one is yellow ochre. And as you can see, the majority of the other colors are all pretty transparent. This is going to have a big impact on your painting or your gel printing, so it's worth taking the time to determine. Now, different brands will vary. Some less expensive brands add fillers to their paint. Typically, these are brands that use descriptive names for their paint instead of standard pigment names. So, for example, ultramarine blue is a pigment name. It's very well known and pretty much available in all brands. Here's one called light blue permanent. This is a mixture of pigments, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Here's one that's called Naples yellow red. That's a descriptive name. There's no pigment called Naples yellow. Doesn't make it a bad paint, though. Now, the key thing to know about these paints is how to find out, before perhaps you buy them, whether they are opaque or transparent. And there's a marking on each tube of paint which will tell you. So, for example, on these golden open paints, you can see the name of the paint. There is a painted stripe here with black stripes underneath it, which visually shows you whether or not it's got some transparency to it. Right down here, it has a pigment identifier on it, PB29. That's ultramarine blue. And right below that is a square with one line going through it. And that means that this paint is semi-transparent. It's pretty transparent, but not as transparent as some. Now, this Indian yellow hue, again, you can see the black stripes through the paint stripe, so you know that it's pretty transparent. And it has a totally clear little square right here. So that tells me for sure that this is a very transparent paint. Here's a golden open paint, very common color, Payne's gray. It's also a mixture. And if you look at the little square here, the little square shows it half black, half white. And this means that it's a semi-opaque paint, so something that is going to have fairly good coverage. And you can also see that here on the paint stripe. You can't see much of the bars through it. This one is carbon black. This is a pure pigment, PBK7. And as you can see, it's got a totally filled in little square here, which means this is a very opaque paint. Now, different brands have things in different places. This is a Liquitex acrylic gouache called light blue permanent. It's made up of 3 pigments. The numbers are given right here. One of the pigments is PW6, which is a white. And you can see that it's an opaque paint. It's got that little square filled in. So this will have fairly good coverage if that's what I'm trying to do. This is an example of the Amsterdam that is got a half filled in box. So this one would be semi-opaque. So now you know how to read the labels on your paint tubes. So for today's video, I'm going to be using my 12 by 14 inch plate. I'm going to be obviously using a brayer. I'm going to be using a 4-inch one. I have a variety of the golden open paints, which I really enjoy using. And if you don't have golden open paint, a really good tip is to get yourself a little jar of the golden open gel and mix that with your regular acrylics, and that will make them behave much more like the ones that I'm using in this video. I'm going to be using a variety of stencils. I would normally be using botanical plants, but they're not available right now. So I'll be using some stencils and also some stamps and things that I've made to provide texture. And the paper I'm going to be printing on today is this rice paper from Yasumoto. It's 9 by 12, it's readily available, and I really like printing on it. So I have a bunch of exercises lined up for you to demonstrate hue, intensity, value, transparency in terms of gel printing. The first thing I need are a variety of base layers to use. My base layers need to be a light to mid value. I'll be incorporating some stamps and stencils into these. And whether the paint is transparent or not doesn't matter to the base layer. Now, if I want to put more than one color on here, I can do it a couple of different ways. So, for example, I could just squeeze a few dabs out. I could add a couple of dabs of a different color to it, and then just roll the two of them together. And this will produce a looser texture. So I'll get a variety of color. But it won't be a very thorough mixture. It'll be little stamps and bits there. And it gives me a mottled effect where the green is stronger in areas, the yellow is stronger in areas. But the combination of the two colors is certainly quite attractive this way. Now, another way to mix the colors would be to have it on a separate little palette. So if I don't want that mottled effect, if I just want to alter the color without creating the unevenness, I can just do that by mixing the color here on a palette and then transferring over some of the mixture onto the plate. As you can see, the color is much more even there. There's some Brayer marks, which I could have gotten rid of if I'd rolled it more thoroughly, but there isn't any separation between the two colors that I mixed together. So I have a nice variety of backgrounds that I've printed up that I can use now as examples in these exercises. Some of these are single paint backgrounds. So for example, there's a bunch here that are all Indian yellow. And then there's a bunch here that I've used blends of colors on the plate. And then back to some simpler ones at the end. So I'm going to explain to you why I'm picking a particular background for a particular example. Different backgrounds will help me explain the different properties of color when it comes to harnessing color on the gel plate. Now, the first property of pigments that I'd like to look at is hue and intensity. So if I'm planning to print several layers on a plate, I need to think about hue. If I want to keep a bright tone, then I need to make sure that the secondary layers of paint don't dull that. So I'm looking at my color wheel, and basically, if I want to keep the bright yellow, I need to pick the next layer's color from this side of the color wheel, known as analogous color. If I want to dull the color, or perhaps contrast it, I could pick a color from across the color wheel. This is known as complementary or split complementary. And that's just a color term. It doesn't mean I'm being nice. So for the first example, let's pick an analogous color. I'm going to start with a little bit of sap green. And in terms of the value, which I've got more exercises explaining that, but I don't want it very thick. If I have it very, very thick, then it's going to cover up whatever's underneath it. So I'm going to keep this layer fairly thin. I want to be able to see through it a bit. So this is on the same side of the color wheel. This is kind of a greenish yellow, or a yellowish green, I guess. So it should go quite well with, say, this print. Now, I don't have any white spaces on this print. This is a solid print. And I do want to be able to see a change in the color. So I'm going to use a stencil, or mask in this case. And yeah, I'm just going to preserve some of this color by masking out this green. So the green is going to transfer into the background, and I'll keep the yellow where the leaves currently are. And I have to do a little bit of rubbing and pressing here. Not a lot. The stencil is quite thin. It's made out of a material called Duralar, which is very, very tough and strong, but also thin, so it prints really well. There we go. So we now have quite a pleasing green in the background with the yellow showing through where the mask retained that color. And some of the texture that was in the original print, the background print, the stripes, is coming through. Let's see what happens now if I do the same thing on a red print. So now green is across the color wheel. And again, I'm going to use the stencil to save some areas from under the original print, from the original base layer. There we go. So I've got this red, and I've got a color from across the color wheel now, a complementary color, going over top of it. There we go. So now you can see very clearly we've still got the original red coming through and some of the texture from that print. But if I compare that to this print, you can see that the green areas over top of the red are now quite dull and less intense in color than when I printed the green over top of the yellow. So this isn't a right or wrong situation by any means. This is a what do you want situation, and knowing how the color on the second layer will affect the color below and the two of them combined will inform your decision as to what you want to put on the second layer of your print. Now there's still some usable paint on this. I'm going to take one of the prints that I made with a stencil. So this still has white areas, and of course it's got the yellow on the same side of the color wheel, analogous color to the green that I've got on here. And now I've got a stencil on here. I'm going to get some of the white will stay where it's covered by both stencils, in the first layer and the second layer. Some of the yellow will stay where it's covered by this, And where the green goes into some of these white spaces, we'll see that. There we go. And let's compare these two prints. So in this print, there was really not much white. There was a tiny bit of white where the base layer was very thin, but mainly just yellow and green. Whereas on this print, there's still white where there was stencils on both layers, they overlapped. There's green, the pure green, which wasn't really on here. And then there's the yellow, and then there's the combination of the green and the yellow. So different effect, again, depending on whether you used a stencil to start with, or whether you started with a solid background. Let's look at value. Some paints are darker and some lighter straight out of the tube. But with gel printing, you can also control the value by the amount of paint used on the plate. A thicker layer rolled up will print darker than the same paint rolled out thinly. Let's take a look at this with Indian yellow. I'm going to put just a small amount of Indian yellow on this side, and I'm going to roll it up really thinly. And by the way, this works out best if you're using golden open paint, because with a thin layer, some paints simply dry too fast for you to be able to get the print off the plate. However, you can also use golden open gel mixed with regular paint to achieve the same thing. And then I'm going to put a thicker layer over on this side. Now, yellow is a fairly light paint. This isn't as light as some yellows, but it's pretty light compared to, say, a purple or a dark blue. So a fair bit of paint on this side and just a little bit on the other side. And you can see the difference. On this side, you've got a darker value. Maybe if 1 is white and 10 is black, this might be a 1 or a 2, whereas this would be more likely to be a 3 or a 4 in the value scale. So think about that. When you're rolling up your print and you're looking for a specific value, how much paint do you want to put on the plate? Another way of controlling the value is to take multiple prints. So I've already taken one print from this area. I'm going to put the paper down again, or a paper down again, trying to get my fingertips not too dirty. It's always a problem when you're jelly printing. I get very messy. Now when I look at that and compare it with the first one, you can see both sides are lighter. So this is kind of a midway between this and this. So I've actually got 4 different values here of the same color. So multiple prints will yield you lighter results as the prints are taking more paint off the plate. Let's take quite a dark paint this time and try the same exercise. So this one is a semi-opaque paint, Payne's Gray. About the only thing I have that's darker than this would be black. So I'm going to put just a little bit on this side, and I'm going to put a bit more on that side. So this is pretty sheer on this side. There's not a lot of paint over here. It almost looks like I've got nothing, but I will. Whereas this side I can roll out to be really pretty solid. And if I decided there was just really not enough paint on this side, I could always take the brayer over here and roll a little of the excess of the one side into the other. There. That still demonstrates what I'm talking about, but in a less extreme way. There we go. So you see, even with quite dark paint, you can still get a lighter value if you wish by rolling it out more thinly. I think one of the most important factors for me in gel printing when it comes to harnessing color is transparency. This is largely a factor of the pigments in the tube of the paint. A semi-opaque paint can be made more transparent by adding the gel medium to it. The first layer of paint on the paper doesn't really matter as much because there's nothing underneath to either show or to cover. A second transparent layer will show the first layer through the second. A second opaque layer will hide the first layer. Let's take a look at some examples. I'm going to use these papers as examples. So each of them has kind of an interesting first layer on it, whether it's the ghost of the stencil itself or a color that's been put on a motley sort of color, a single color, or another motley color one. So I would like definitely these patterns to show up in the second layer, so I'm going to choose a transparent paint to go over them. And in this case, I'm going to use transparent red iron oxide as the example. Now, transparent red iron oxide is not as red as you might think. It's really more of a brown, and it is very, very transparent. Now again, how much color is going to go through depends on how much paint I put on the plate, so I'm going to have to be mindful of that. I don't want it to totally overwhelm what's already on the paper. And there's really, like I say, there's no right or wrong with this. It's just a case of what do you want? What do you want your print after the next layer to look like? And then taking into consideration some of these aspects about hue, value, and transparency, that will help you figure out what to do next. Now, what stencil to go with next is a subject I could actually do another whole video on. If you're interested in that, please let me know in the comments. But I think this one with sort of this sideways pattern will enhance this print, which has more of a vertical pattern. And there's enough areas which are going to block out this transparent red iron oxide that'll hopefully give me some interest on this one. A lot of the choice of a stencil, mind you, is very personal. I just happen to like the lyrical shapes of botanicals, so that's what I generally use for stencils. Oh yeah, so this is quite interesting. So I have the transparent red iron oxide coming through where it was previously white. I do have some white areas. I have some of the green coming through where, from the original print, that green was from the original print, where I've got my new stencil on. And I also have a combination of the transparent red iron oxide and the green in certain areas. So I'm ending up here with 4 values. That one, that one, that one, and then the combination. So I can clearly see the original pattern underneath that transparent paint. Now this is a situation where I have a light transparent red iron oxide with a ghost. And I think it might look interesting over top of that ghost. Now, because neither of these prints were made using a stencil, there's not going to be any white on the resulting print. There wasn't any white on the original print. But this is a good example of how I can still very clearly see both prints or layers. The original green one and then the orange one that was put on top, the transparent red iron oxide that was put on top. For the next example, I'm going to be using anthracnone blue. Now this is a semi-transparent. It's pretty transparent color. However, it is a very dark and strong color. So if I want it to combine with my somewhat wimpy yellow print, I'm going to have to put it on fairly thinly. Some paints take a little bit more rolling out to get that even layer, especially when you're doing it thinly. Okay, I've got this one this time. So I think I'll use this stencil. It should give me a nice pattern. So given that we're putting a blue over top of a yellow, we would expect maybe the areas where they overlap to become greenish. We used a stencil in both the first and the second prints, so we're expecting some white and some blue and some yellow. Oh, there we go. Yes, you can see the anthracnone blue has come through where the stencil was previously white. We have some white areas. Where the second layer had a stencil, we've got the yellow from the first layer, and then we have this lovely sort of mottled blue, a green effect. And that's what I kind of like. Rather than just mixing those two paints together and applying them on separate layers does something just a little bit different. So this is a transparent color, but in this roll-up I'm going to use just a little bit more paint, make it a little bit darker. This has some greens in it, which is an analogous color. It's close to it on the color wheel. But it also has a little bit of transparent red iron oxide running through it, which is across the wheel, and a little bit of yellow, which is further away on the wheel. Now you can see the stronger value of that blue has really subdued the background. We still have some pure blue and some greens that are showing through, but it's really quite killed the reds that were in there and the yellows that were in there. But we now have this new image in relief with a dark background. We've still got some whites, and we've got a clear image of the botanicals. This is a good example of how the amount of paint that you put on the plate really affects the image that you're going to get. So let's take a look at using some opaque colors on the plate. Up to this point, we've primarily been using transparent colors. Even in the color hue intensity section, we've pretty much been looking at transparent colors. I really like them. I use them a lot. But there is definitely a time and a place for an opaque paint. So if I want to use an opaque layer, the first thing to do is to start with some opaque paints. Obvious candidates: titanium white, carbon black. Both of those are very opaque, and anything I mix with those will become quite opaque. And then we have the ones that are mostly opaque, like a Payne's gray. If I use enough of that on the plate, don't roll it out too thin, that one's going to be fairly opaque. And then I've got some which aren't the golden open colors that I can mix in with some of the golden opens as well. These are all opaque colors. Now this print I think would be interesting if I used an opaque over it, and I think I'm going to use this Liquitex Light Blue Permanent. I am going to use a little bit of the white. Now this doesn't have much of a pattern. It has a little bit of a pattern. But what I'd like to do is use a fairly light stencil with it. And by that I mean one that has, smaller spaces. It's not too, doesn't have large spaces on it. Now I just used this one. Oops. But the jammy side goes down, so I can use it again without polluting the paint. And most of this is going to go blue on here. Take a peek. There we go. Oh yeah. That's quite interesting. So on a print like this one, I feel like I have some really interesting areas. And I could just use it for collage, and I cut them up into circles and things. But the other option is to again use circles, squares, whatever, heart shapes, dumbbells, whatever you think. And basically to preserve some of these different sections that I kind of like maybe that section up there, and kind of like that one down there as well. And if I want to preserve specific areas, then I need these masks to be positioned accurately. And the easiest thing I found to do that is by using this repositional tape. I get this one from Michael's. So I just put a little bit on the back there, try to figure out roughly where I want it, and it will stay there. It's easy to get off. It's not going to leave any messy bits. It won't leave any messy bits on the mask or on the paper. It's very easy to remove it. So basically what I want to do is mask everything else off but those spots. Now I have to decide whether it would be advantageous to do it in a darker color or a lighter color. I think I'm going to go with dark for this one. So I'm going to use some carbon black, and then I think because there's already some really quite nice blue in that print, I'm going to use some anthracnone blue as well. This should be good and dark. This might be something you're interested in if you like to make cards. Choose a shape which suits your visual vocabulary. Take a print and then use an opaque to mask the rest of it, and then cut it out into whatever shape maybe your card is or whatever else you want to be using it for. Now you can see the dark paint coming through this paper, so I can tell it's good and dark. I'm going to give it a good buff. Get some sharp edges around those masks, the rectangular one and the circular one. There we go. And in this case, the mask is going to gently peel off for me. So I really like this effect. This gives me a lovely window into the bits of the print that I really, really liked. So let's look back at the properties of pigments. First of all, hue and intensity. For the first layer of a print, you can use a single color or a mixture. You can either mix the colors right on the plate by applying them and then rolling them up, which gives you a more broken color effect, or you can pre-mix the paint on a separate palette and then transfer it to your plate and roll it up, which gives you more even color. When adding a layer to an existing print, choosing a color from the same side of the color wheel will keep the color more intense, while choosing a color from the opposite side of the color wheel will result in more neutral color where the two layers overlap. Value. As well as mixing paint to modify its value. With gel printing, you can control the value of paint by varying the amount on the plate. So if you put a lot of paint on the plate before you roll it up, you'll get a darker value than the same color if you roll it up very thinly. And that works with all different kinds of paint. The other way that you can modify the value is to pull a second print. When you pull a second print, it will be lighter than the first print that you pulled. Transparency and opacity. Paints either lean towards the transparent or they lean towards the opaque. Used as a second layer, the transparent paint allows the first layer to show through, whereas an opaque paint will hide what's underneath. Here is an example of a fairly bright, colorful, warm first layer that's been covered up pretty thoroughly by an opaque layer. In this example, it's more subtle because the opaque paint was closer in hue and value to what was already underneath. So I hope this video has been helpful for you. Try some experiments of your own and let me know how you make out in the comments. Happy printing!